In the quiet, affluent suburbs where lawns are always manicured and lives appear picture-perfect, the Harper family stood as a shining example of success. Eleanor Harper, a powerhouse in her industry, had built a life that many envied. Her home, a sprawling estate nestled among towering oaks, was a testament to her achievements. Jonathan Harper, her second husband, brought charm and warmth into their world, seamlessly integrating himself into the family dynamic. And then there was Claire, Eleanor's daughter from her first marriage, a brilliant young woman with dreams of becoming an artist, whose laughter filled the halls of their home. To outsiders, they were the epitome of harmony, a family bound by love and shared ambitions. But appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic existence lay currents of unease, whispers of secrets unspoken. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Eleanor noticed the way Jonathan and Claire exchanged glances during dinner parties, their eyes lingering just a fraction too long. She overheard fragments of hushed conversations, snippets of words that left her uneasy but without clear meaning. At first, she dismissed these moments as mere coincidences, the product of an overactive imagination fueled by late nights and demanding work schedules. But as time passed, the signs grew more pronounced, gnawing at her resolve to ignore them. Then came the night that shattered everything. Eleanor had been called away on a last-minute business trip, one she had anticipated would keep her away for several days. Exhausted and burdened by stress, she decided to return home earlier than planned, seeking solace in the familiar comforts of her own bed. As she pulled into the driveway under the cover of darkness, a strange stillness enveloped the house. The lights were dimmed, the usual sounds of life muted. Climbing the stairs, her heart began to race, though she couldn't quite place why. A faint noise emanated from Claire's room, soft enough to blend with the creaks of the old floorboards yet loud enough to demand attention. With trembling hands, Eleanor pushed open the door, her breath catching in her throat as the scene before her unfolded like a nightmare made real. In the dim glow of the bedside lamp, she saw what no mother should ever have to witness, Jonathan and Claire, entwined in an embrace that defied all boundaries of morality and trust. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, suspended in the air between them. Shock rooted Eleanor to the spot, her mind struggling to comprehend the betrayal etched in every detail of the tableau before her. As reality crashed down upon her, Eleanor felt a storm surge within, a tempest of emotions threatening to consume her whole. Anger, disbelief, and heartbreak collided in a torrent so fierce it left her breathless. How could this happen? How could the man she had entrusted with her heart and the daughter she had raised with unconditional love betray her in such a devastating manner? The questions swirled endlessly, each one cutting deeper than the last. And yet, even amidst the chaos of her thoughts, a seed of determination began to take root. This was not merely a personal betrayal, it was an affront to everything she believed in, everything she had worked for. The Harper family, once a beacon of stability and grace, now teetered on the brink of ruin. Eleanor knew she had two choices: let the pain destroy her or rise above it, reclaiming control of her life and ensuring justice, for herself, for her family, and for the truth. But what form would that justice take? And at what cost? The answers would come later, after careful planning and reflection. For now, Eleanor retreated into the shadows, her mind already turning toward the future. She understood that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. Those responsible for this betrayal would face consequences far greater than they could ever imagine. Eleanor Harper's world had been shattered, but the pieces were still sharp enough to cut. In the days following her discovery of Jonathan and Claire's betrayal, she retreated into a cocoon of calculated silence. To the outside world, she appeared composed, her professional demeanor intact as she navigated her high-powered career. But inside, Eleanor was consumed by a maelstrom of emotions: anger, hurt, humiliation, and an unrelenting desire for justice. She couldn't let this go unpunished. What they had done wasn't just a personal affront, it was a violation of everything she held sacred. Her first step was gathering evidence. Eleanor knew that if she wanted to expose their secret, she needed irrefutable proof. She began documenting every interaction between Jonathan and Claire, capturing moments through photographs taken from hidden angles, screenshots of incriminating text messages on Jonathan's phone, and even voice recordings of hushed conversations overheard in the house. It wasn't easy, each piece of evidence felt like another stab to her heart, but Eleanor pressed on, driven by a cold determination. Her once bright home now served as a stage for her investigation, its walls echoing with secrets she had uncovered. Jonathan remained oblivious, his charm undiminished. He continued to play the part of the devoted husband, kissing Eleanor goodbye each morning before heading off to work. "Have a good day," he would say, his smile warm and genuine, or so it seemed. Eleanor forced herself to respond politely, masking her seething rage behind a practiced veneer of civility. She watched him closely, noting how effortlessly he slipped back into his role, how he made plans for dinners, vacations, and shared futures, all lies built upon the foundation of their illicit affair. Every word out of his mouth grated against her resolve, fueling her need for retribution. Claire, however, bore the weight of her guilt more visibly. The bright, spirited young woman who had once filled the house with laughter now moved through life like a shadow, her eyes downcast and her steps hesitant. She avoided Eleanor whenever possible, retreating to her room or spending hours at school under the pretense of studying. When they did cross paths, Claire's gaze would dart away, unable to meet her mother's piercing stare. At night, Eleanor could hear her daughter crying softly in her room, the sound both heartbreaking and infuriating. How could Claire have betrayed her trust so completely? And yet, despite her anger, Eleanor couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow for the girl she had raised since infancy, the same girl who had once confided all her dreams and fears to her mother. As the weeks passed, Eleanor's plan began to take shape. It wasn't enough to confront them outright, she wanted something far more devastating, something that would leave them broken and humiliated. She considered various scenarios, weighing the risks and rewards of each. Public exposure. Too messy, too unpredictable. Legal action. Too slow, too impersonal. No, Eleanor decided, the best revenge would come directly from her own hand, a carefully orchestrated scheme designed to destroy them without implicating herself. The opportunity presented itself one evening when Eleanor stumbled across an old family heirloom, a vintage key tucked away in the attic. The key opened a long-forgotten safe hidden within the walls of their estate, a safe that contained documents dating back decades, including wills, deeds, and financial records. Among these papers, Eleanor discovered a contract signed years ago by Jonathan during his previous marriage. It was a prenuptial agreement stipulating that in the event of infidelity, all assets would revert solely to his ex-wife. This revelation sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. If exposed, it could bankrupt Jonathan, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back. But Eleanor didn't stop there. She also found a series of letters written by Claire's biological father, detailing his regrets and hopes for his daughter's future. These letters had been stored away after his death, meant to be given to Claire when she came of age. Now, Eleanor saw a new purpose for them. By manipulating the contents of those letters, she could create the illusion of a dark family secret, one that might tarnish Claire's reputation and sever her ties with friends and loved ones. With her tools in place, Eleanor set about laying the groundwork for her plan. She started small, planting seeds of doubt in Jonathan and Claire's minds. Subtle changes around the house, a misplaced document here, a whispered comment there, were enough to make them question each other's motives. Eleanor also distanced herself further from her social circle, creating the impression that she was struggling emotionally. Friends called, concerned, but Eleanor brushed them off, citing stress and exhaustion. In reality, she was preparing for the final act of her elaborate game. Then came the suggestion for a weekend getaway, a retreat to a secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods. Eleanor framed it as a last-ditch effort to salvage their fractured family, though her true intentions were far darker. The cabin, isolated and surrounded by dense forest, offered the perfect setting for her plan. Neither Jonathan nor Claire suspected anything amiss, both agreed to the trip, albeit reluctantly. For Eleanor, it marked the beginning of the end. On the drive to the cabin, tension hung heavy in the air. Jonathan attempted light conversation, but Eleanor responded curtly, her mind already miles ahead. Claire stared out the window, lost in thought, while Jonathan glanced nervously between the two women, sensing the unspoken discord. As they pulled up to the cabin, the oppressive atmosphere only thickened. The structure stood silent against the backdrop of towering pines, its windows reflecting the dim glow of twilight. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself for what lay ahead. Inside, she went through the motions of settling in, unpacking bags and preparing a simple meal. Yet every gesture felt hollow, every smile forced. Dinner was eaten in strained silence, the crackling fire providing the only sound in the room. Afterward, Eleanor excused herself, claiming exhaustion, though in truth, she needed time alone to prepare. Upstairs, she retrieved the items she had brought along, the key, the letters, and a vial of sedative she had acquired discreetly. Each object represented a piece of her plan, a step toward the vengeance she craved. As the night wore on, Eleanor waited patiently, listening for the sounds of sleep below. When she was certain Jonathan and Claire were deeply unconscious, she descended the stairs, her movements fluid and deliberate. The cabin seemed alive with anticipation, its shadows stretching long and menacing. Eleanor approached the living area where her targets lay sleeping, their breathing steady and unaware. With careful precision, she administered the sedative, ensuring they would remain incapacitated for hours. Now, the moment of truth was upon her. Eleanor stood over them, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. What she had planned was irreversible, a line she could never uncross. But as she looked at Jonathan's smug face and Claire's innocent features, her resolve hardened. They deserved this, she told herself. They had chosen this path, and now they would pay the price. And so, Eleanor began. The suggestion for the weekend getaway came as a surprise to both Jonathan and Claire, but Eleanor Harper had planned it meticulously. Under the pretense of salvaging what remained of their fractured family, she proposed a retreat to a secluded cabin nestled deep in the mountains. It was a place they had visited once before, a rustic retreat surrounded by towering pines and miles of untouched wilderness. To Jonathan and Claire, it seemed like an innocent attempt to mend fences. But Eleanor knew better. This wasn't about reconciliation, it was about retribution. As they packed their bags and prepared for the journey, Eleanor's heart raced with anticipation. She had everything she needed, evidence of their betrayal tucked safely away, her emotions hardened into resolve, and a plan that would leave no room for escape. The drive to the cabin stretched over winding roads, the landscape growing more isolated with each passing mile. Inside the car, the tension was palpable. Jonathan tried to make small talk, his voice cheerful but forced. Claire stared out the window, lost in thought, her mind burdened by guilt and unease. Eleanor responded to Jonathan's attempts at conversation with curt replies, her focus elsewhere. Every word exchanged only deepened the chasm between them, though none dared to voice the unspoken dread that hung in the air. When they arrived at the cabin, the isolation struck them all. Dense forest surrounded the structure, its windows reflecting the fading light of late afternoon. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Eleanor stepped out of the car first, taking a deep breath as she surveyed the scene. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to remain calm, masking her inner turmoil behind a practiced smile. Inside, Eleanor moved with purpose, going through the motions of settling in while her mind churned with calculations. She unpacked their bags, arranged food for meals, and lit a fire in the hearth, all the while maintaining the facade of a mother trying to create a warm atmosphere. Jonathan and Claire watched her with wary eyes, sensing something amiss but unable to pinpoint exactly what. They exchanged glances, their unease growing with each passing minute. For Eleanor, this performance was crucial. If her plan was to succeed, she needed them off guard, unaware of the storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. As evening fell, Eleanor prepared a simple dinner, her movements deliberate yet calculated. She served the meal with forced cheerfulness, encouraging conversation that faltered almost immediately. Jonathan spoke of work, Claire muttered vague responses, and Eleanor nodded along, her thoughts drifting to the events that had led them here. Over dessert, she suggested a toast, to new beginnings, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos within her. As they clinked glasses, Eleanor felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching the scene unfold from afar. After dinner, the trio gathered around the fireplace, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows across their faces. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, attempting to relax, though the stiffness in his posture betrayed his discomfort. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest, her gaze fixed on the fire. Eleanor perched nearby, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Jonathan broke it eventually, suggesting they turn in early after such a long day. Claire agreed quickly, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. Once upstairs, Claire slipped into her room, closing the door softly behind her. Jonathan lingered briefly, offering Eleanor a hesitant goodnight kiss that she accepted without emotion. Alone in her bedroom, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of reflection. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her, but she pushed it aside. There was no turning back now. She retrieved a small vial from her bag, its contents shimmering faintly in the dim light. A sedative, strong enough to render her targets unconscious for hours. It was the key to her plan. Eleanor waited until she heard the soft snores coming from the rooms below before slipping out of bed. Moving silently through the cabin, she retrieved a bottle of wine from the kitchen, pouring 2 glasses and adding precise drops of the sedative to each. Returning to the living room, she shook Jonathan awake gently, offering him a glass with a soft smile. "One last toast," she murmured, her voice eerily calm. He accepted it without suspicion, too groggy to notice anything amiss. Claire stirred next, and Eleanor handed her a glass as well. "To new beginnings," she repeated, her words hollow even to her own ears. Within minutes, the sedative took effect. Jonathan's head lolled forward, his breathing deepening as sleep claimed him. Claire followed soon after, her body slumping against the couch. Eleanor stood over them, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had envisioned countless times in her mind. With trembling hands, she tied their wrists and ankles with rope, ensuring the knots were tight enough to prevent escape. Each movement brought a surge of adrenaline, fueling her resolve. When they were securely bound, she stepped back, surveying her handiwork. The sight of them helpless before her filled her with a twisted sense of satisfaction. But Eleanor wasn't finished yet. She retrieved a knife from the kitchen, its blade glinting in the dim light. She had chosen it carefully, knowing it would serve her purpose perfectly. Standing over Jonathan and Claire, she let the full weight of her anger wash over her. How dare they betray her? How dare they destroy the life she had built? The questions swirled in her mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. Yet as she raised the knife high above her head, a sudden wave of clarity hit her. What was she doing? Had their betrayal truly driven her to this point? The image of Claire's tear-streaked face flashed in her mind, and for the first time, doubt crept in. Was this really the path she wanted to take? Could she live with the consequences of her actions? For a moment, Eleanor hesitated, her grip on the knife loosening. The sound of Claire's muffled sobs reached her ears, pulling her back from the brink. Whatever else had happened, Claire was still her daughter, the child she had raised since birth. And Jonathan, he may have betrayed her trust, but killing him wouldn't bring back the love she had once felt for him. Eleanor dropped the knife, the metallic clang echoing through the silent cabin. Trembling, she backed away, her mind racing. What had she become? What had this betrayal turned her into? The realization hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't go through with it, not like this. Turning on her heel, Eleanor fled the cabin, running blindly into the night. The cold mountain air stung her lungs as she stumbled through the forest, her feet pounding against the earth. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping through her hair as she stared down at the jagged rocks below. For a fleeting moment, she considered ending it all, letting go of the pain, the anger, the humiliation. But something inside her shifted. Ending her life wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't undo the betrayal or erase the scars it had left. No, she had to find another way. With renewed determination, Eleanor turned and walked back toward the cabin. Her mind was clearer now, her resolve tempered by reason. When she returned, she untied Jonathan and Claire, her hands shaking as she released the ropes. Neither spoke as they were freed, too stunned to react. Eleanor stood before them, her voice barely audible as she whispered an apology. Without waiting for their response, she turned and walked out into the night, leaving them behind. Alone in the darkness, Eleanor began the long journey toward healing. She didn't know where it would lead, but she knew one thing for certain: she had survived the darkest parts of herself, and now she was ready to rebuild. The night was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the cabin's hearth. Eleanor Harper had waited for this moment for weeks, her mind consumed by thoughts of vengeance and retribution. As the clock struck midnight, she slipped quietly out of bed, her movements deliberate yet cautious. The plan she had meticulously crafted over countless sleepless nights was finally coming to fruition. In the kitchen, Eleanor retrieved a bottle of wine from the cabinet, its contents shimmering faintly under the dim light of the moon filtering through the window. Alongside it, she pulled out a small vial containing a powerful sedative she had acquired through discreet means. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured 2 glasses, adding precise drops of the drug to each. It was a dose strong enough to render Jonathan and Claire unconscious for hours, giving her ample time to execute the next phase of her plan. Returning to the living room, where Jonathan and Claire were already slumbering by the fire, Eleanor gently shook them awake. Both stirred groggily, their eyes bleary with sleep. She offered them the glasses of wine, her voice calm and controlled. "One last toast," she said softly, her words laced with a chilling finality. "To new beginnings." Neither suspected anything amiss, too drowsy to notice the subtle bitterness in the liquid they drank. Within minutes, the sedative took effect, their heads lolling back as they slipped into a deep, unresponsive sleep. Eleanor stood over them, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had envisioned so vividly in her mind. With calculated precision, she moved to secure them. From a hidden compartment in her bag, she withdrew lengths of rope, their coarse texture familiar beneath her trembling fingers. She began with Jonathan, binding his wrists and ankles tightly, ensuring the knots were secure enough to prevent escape. Then she turned her attention to Claire, her movements mechanical despite the turmoil churning within her. Each knot tied felt like another brick added to the wall she had built around her heart, hardening her resolve even further. When both were securely bound, Eleanor stepped back, surveying her handiwork. The sight before her was surreal: Jonathan and Claire, helpless and vulnerable, their fates entirely in her hands. A strange sense of power washed over her, mingling with the anger and hurt that had fueled her actions. For the first time since discovering their betrayal, she felt in control. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form in her carefully constructed facade. As dawn approached, Jonathan and Claire began to stir, their minds foggy with the effects of the sedative. When they realized their predicament, panic set in immediately. They struggled against their bonds, their muffled cries filling the once quiet cabin. Eleanor watched them silently, her expression unreadable, waiting for the full weight of their situation to sink in. "You think you can get away with this?" Jonathan spat, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and defiance. "What are you planning to do, Eleanor? Kill us?" Her lips curled into a cold smile. "Oh, Jonathan," she replied, her tone dripping with disdain. "You don't deserve the privilege of knowing what comes next. All I care about is making sure you both pay for what you've done." Claire's sobs grew louder, her body racked with tears. "Mom, please," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I'm so sorry. Please don't do this." Eleanor's gaze softened momentarily at the sound of her daughter's anguish, but she quickly hardened her heart. "Sorry isn't enough, Claire," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "You destroyed everything we had. Everything I built. And now, you'll face the consequences." But as she prepared to carry out her ultimate act of vengeance, a murder that would bury their sin forever, something inside her faltered. The image of Claire's tear-streaked face flashed in her mind, pulling her back from the brink. How could she go through with this? Was killing them truly the answer? Would it bring back the trust they had shattered or restore the family she had lost? For the first time since uncovering their betrayal, doubt crept into Eleanor's mind. She remembered the years spent raising Claire, the laughter-filled days and late-night talks. She thought of the love she had once shared with Jonathan, however fleeting it may have been. Had their actions really driven her to this point? Could she live with herself if she crossed this line? The sound of Claire's desperate pleas echoed in her ears, jolting her back to reality. "Mom, please," Claire repeated, her voice raw with emotion. "I know I messed up. I betrayed you. But you're still my mother. You're all I have left." Eleanor froze, her hand hovering over the knife she had retrieved from the kitchen earlier. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. What had she become? What had this betrayal turned her into? In her quest for justice, had she become just as monstrous as the people she sought to punish? Tears welled in her eyes as the enormity of her actions hit her. She couldn't do it, not like this. Killing them wouldn't erase the pain or undo the damage they had caused. It would only add more blood to her hands, more guilt to her conscience. Slowly, she lowered the knife, her grip loosening until it clattered to the floor. Standing there amidst the chaos she had created, Eleanor felt a wave of clarity wash over her. This wasn't the path she wanted to take, not anymore. Whatever else happened, she couldn't let her anger consume her completely. She had to find another way, a way that didn't involve becoming the very thing she despised. With trembling hands, Eleanor untied Jonathan and Claire, releasing them from their bonds. Neither spoke as they were freed, too stunned to react. She backed away, her eyes downcast, unable to meet their gazes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." Turning on her heel, Eleanor fled the cabin, running blindly into the night. The cold mountain air stung her lungs as she stumbled through the forest, her feet pounding against the earth. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping through her hair as she stared down at the jagged rocks below. For a fleeting moment, she considered ending it all, letting go of the pain, the anger, the humiliation. But something inside her shifted. Ending her life wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't undo the betrayal or erase the scars it had left. No, she had to find another way, a way to rebuild, to heal, to move forward. With renewed determination, Eleanor turned and walked back toward the cabin. Her mind was clearer now, her resolve tempered by reason. When she returned, she found Jonathan and Claire still sitting where she had left them, their expressions a mixture of relief and confusion. Without waiting for their response, she turned and walked out into the night, leaving them behind. Alone in the darkness, Eleanor began the long journey toward healing. She didn't know where it would lead, but she knew one thing for certain: she had survived the darkest parts of herself, and now she was ready to rebuild. Eleanor Harper stood at the edge of the cliff, her body trembling as the cold night wind whipped through her hair. The jagged rocks below shimmered faintly under the moonlight, their sharp edges a stark reminder of how fragile life could be. For a moment, she considered stepping forward, letting go of all the pain, anger, and betrayal that had consumed her for so long. It would be easy, she thought, a simple step, and everything would end. No more heartache, no more guilt, no more memories of what had transpired in that cabin. But as she stared down into the abyss, something inside her shifted. Ending her life wouldn't erase the past or undo the damage done to her family. It wouldn't bring back the trust she had lost, nor would it restore the bond she once shared with Claire. Death was an escape, yes, but it wasn't redemption. Eleanor realized she couldn't let Andrew and Claire's betrayal destroy her completely. She had to find another way, a way to survive, to heal, to rebuild. With a deep breath, Eleanor stepped back from the edge, her resolve strengthening with each passing second. She turned and walked away from the precipice, her feet crunching against the gravel beneath her. As she made her way back through the dense forest toward the cabin, her mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. The journey would be difficult, perhaps even unbearable at times, but she knew one thing for certain: she had to face it head-on. When Eleanor returned to the cabin, the sight of Jonathan and Claire still bound on the floor filled her with a mix of shame and sorrow. They looked up at her with wide, fearful eyes, their faces pale with terror. For a brief moment, Eleanor hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she knelt beside them and began to untie the ropes. Her hands shook as she worked, the knots loosening one by one until both were free. Neither Jonathan nor Claire spoke as they regained their freedom. They sat there in stunned silence, too overwhelmed to react. Eleanor rose to her feet, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." Jonathan rubbed his wrists where the ropes had left angry red marks, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Claire, who remained silent, her body still trembling from the ordeal. Finally, he broke the silence. "What now?" he asked, his tone devoid of anger or accusation, only weariness. Eleanor met his gaze for the first time since uncovering their secret. "Now, we move forward," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. "This doesn't have to destroy us entirely. We can try to make sense of this mess." The words hung heavy in the air, unspoken questions lingering between them. How could they possibly move forward after everything that had happened? Could forgiveness ever truly exist among them? But Eleanor didn't wait for answers. She knew she couldn't force reconciliation, all she could do was take responsibility for her actions and hope for the best. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor withdrew from the life she had known. She filed for divorce from Jonathan, citing irreconcilable differences. Though painful, the separation brought a strange sense of clarity. Their marriage had been built on lies and deceit, and continuing it would only prolong the agony. Jonathan accepted the terms without resistance, understanding that neither of them could salvage what remained of their relationship. As for Claire, Eleanor reached out cautiously, sending letters filled with apologies and heartfelt confessions. At first, there was no response, only silence. But slowly, Claire began to reply, her words tentative yet sincere. Together, they embarked on the arduous process of rebuilding their fractured relationship. It wasn't easy, there were arguments, tears, and moments of doubt, but gradually, a fragile connection re-emerged. They learned to communicate openly, confronting their fears and insecurities together. Months later, Eleanor packed her belongings and moved to a small coastal town far removed from the suburban world she had once called home. The change of scenery offered her a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the shadows of her past. She found solace in the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore and the quiet solitude of her modest apartment. Life here was simpler, slower, and though it came with its own challenges, Eleanor embraced it wholeheartedly. She continued writing to Claire, sharing stories of her new experiences and encouraging her daughter to visit whenever she felt ready. Slowly, Claire began making trips to the town, spending weekends with Eleanor and rediscovering the joy they had once shared. Their bond grew stronger with each passing visit, though it bore the scars of their history. Jonathan, too, moved on with his life. He relocated to another city, seeking a fresh start of his own. Though their divorce had been amicable, both acknowledged the wounds that might never fully heal. Still, they parted ways with mutual respect, grateful for the opportunity to rebuild themselves independently. Standing on the porch of her new home one evening, Eleanor watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The scene was breathtaking, a perfect metaphor for the peace she had finally found. She reflected on the events that had led her here, the betrayal, the rage, the near descent into madness, and realized that while she couldn't change the past, she could choose how to live with it. She had faced her darkest moments and emerged on the other side, scarred but resilient. For the first time in months, Eleanor allowed herself to smile. She had survived the storm, and now, she was ready to embrace the calm. With hope in her heart and determination in her soul, she vowed to build a future filled with light, love, and renewal. A new chapter awaited her, one of healing, forgiveness, and endless possibilities.